Is one of the lessons, David, that we just have to be incredibly suspicious about polling just because the Trump people don't want to talk to pollsters, like just going forward?
Yeah, that's one that I've got a couple of different thoughts on.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, we should talk about that.
Yeah, we
Save it for the show, but yeah. No.
Yeah.
I think we're live.
We're live, but we're bantering. But we can unbanter and actually talk turkey here, you know.
Yeah. No, I will just throw out that the last time that I talked to David Byler, I was chatting in to the last time he was on the live stream, and I made him promise that his analysis was correct. He had to swear that it was definitely going to turn out the way he did. And you were at a reasonable degree of certainty, as I recall.
What in particular were you so concerned about, Sarah?
Oh, I was concerned that he was wrong.
About what?
I think it was the Biden. It was Joe Biden.
2020.
Oh, it was about 2020. Okay.
Yeah, it was closer than I thought it was going to be. Yeah, that outcome was in the distribution, but it was not the center. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that happens. That's why there are distributions. I mean,
exactly.
Sort of. I mean, you could argue that.
Yeah.
Okay, should we begin here? And why not? Welcome to the Bulwark Plus live stream. Loyal viewers, participants, questioners, friends. I'm Bill Kristol, Sarah Longwell, Mona Charen, you know, David Byler, you should know. He's now at the Washington Post as a data analyst, columnist, election guru, really a sound analyst of elections and of beyond elections, actually, of our political system, and used to be at the Weekly Standard before he stepped down to the Post. So it's good to have you back. Good to have you with us. I think, David, you were on before the election. That's what Sarah was talking about, and we're pretty confident in Biden, but it was a little less of a margin than we thought. So tell us where we are now. Well, I mean, I sort of Mona's earlier question. I'll just also mention that. I mean, how accurate are the polls? Is there a systematic problem of non-response? I think there was an exit polls, 20 years ago. I remember being in the ABC green room in 2004, I guess, and everyone saying that very, very close. Kerry could beat Bush. Looks really. And I remember saying, I don't know, these exit polls are kind of been, a little screwy, and there's some non-response maybe from Republicanish types. They see the 24-year-old grad student who looks like Byler, asking them with a clipboard, asking questions, and they're like, I don't really want to talk to that person, and all the Democratic voters are eager to share their thoughts, since it's like a fellow grad student or something. And there was a 2 or 3 or 4 point error, but it's gotten a little more startling in the last 15 years, or no? So tell us about polls a little, but then tell us on the substance. I think what we all want to hear is, where's Biden? I mean, how much below where he was? Is it a 2-point drop? Are we talking about a real bottom falling out, et cetera? So take it away.
Yeah.
We'll interrupt you. Sarah and Mona will interrupt you.
Yeah, interrupt whenever. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. It's great to see all you guys. I love working with you guys at the Weekly Standard, and it's always great to see you again. So,
and I should say, David is in Los Angeles, and he's we'll have to cut this off at 9 sharp for the 5th game of the LA San Francisco series. Yeah.
Fingers crossed. Yeah. So in terms of polling error, this is a big question that I spent time on, that a lot of people in my world have spent time on. And there's some things that we can rule out, and there are some sort of likely culprits for the polling error. The first thing to say is that we're in a bad way with surveys in presidential elections. What you see when you look at 2020, when you look, the state level results of 2018, you look at 2016, you even look at 2014, you see persistent errors in states that have a high number of white non-college educated voters. These are the states where Trump is gaining. These are the states where Trump performed unexpectedly well in 2020. These are states where Republicans gained Senate seats in 2014. You have kind of a persistent problem. And a lot of things that pollsters have done have not really worked to solve it. They've made it better, but they haven't worked. So one thing that everyone tried after the 2016 election was to weight by education, was to make sure that you had enough college educated and non-college educated voters in your sample. That obviously didn't eliminate the error in 2020. That helped, but it didn't eliminate it. People have done tests. You've compared online to normal phone polls to try to ferret out, okay, are these people lying to pollsters? And it doesn't appear that the people that pollsters are contacting are actually lying. If you get someone on the phone, they're pretty likely to tell you the truth. The leading candidate right now for polling error is something that is much more pernicious, which is the idea that there are people who have a low amount of social trust, people who don't think much of the government, the media, their local institutions, churches, anybody, people who don't trust anyone in the world except for maybe Donald Trump and their immediate family members, right? That those types of people are just not picking up the phone. And that's a hard problem because there's not really a clear solution to it. If a certain group of people that is politically relevant does not pick up the phone, you can't go to their house and make them pick up the phone. There's just this sort of shadow group that's there. So in terms of polling error, given that survey research is a big part of my job, demographics and polling is a lot of it, I'm worried. I'm a little freaked out about the accuracy of polling in key states and just a little bit more generally. So with that being said, I'm gonna heap on sort of a little bit more bad news for Democratic voters. I'm gonna share my screen real quick here and show you that Joe Biden is not in a great way. Shoot, where's the graphic that I want to show you?
Can I just ask you one thing while you're figuring out
Yeah.
the technology? But I mean, if there's a systematic error plus it's 2-3%, it's not 10-15%, right? So people shouldn't, it's not like we're seeing something totally different from reality. We're seeing a bit of a skewed reality. And B, presumably trends in the same polling, the universe and with the same polling methodology should be somewhat directionally accurate. I mean, if someone goes from 48 to 42, he or she has probably dropped 5 or 6 points. It just may really be from 51 to 45 or from 45 to, I can't do the math, to 40. But I mean, the direction is presumably not affected that much by this. The same error is repeating itself, so to speak.
Right. So 2 things about this. It's true. If you have a national number that says, 80% of people like one policy and 20% of people like the other policy, this isn't going to make a big difference.
Right.
But the issue is that we're in an era of such tightly contested elections. In 2022, Democrats are, I think, going to have 5-8 seat advantage, right? When you're in that kind of a margin, like those sorts of small errors matter. When you have thin electoral college margins, this sort of thing matters. So globally, it's true. You're 100% right. Maybe my hair is on fire too much. It's not like we know 0 total things. And you're also correct that directionally, oftentimes, even if polls are biased in one direction, the trend will be the same. The one thing that I would add to that is occasionally you can get phantom swings, and you have to watch out for that, where, there's a news event that happens and Democrats are really upset with Biden, so they temporarily don't pick up the phone at a high rate, like real Democratic diehards or something like that. There's speculation that's part of why Biden's numbers got so high during the 2020 election, is that a bunch of Democrats who stayed home during COVID were like, I don't have anything to do. And then they would pick up the phone, and Republicans who were living their lives and putting themselves in danger of catching coronavirus weren't picking up the phone at the same rate. So there's, speculation along those lines. But the bad news for Biden is that swings that were supposed to be phantom swings are seemingly not. So this right here is something that I have not published yet, so don't steal it. But I think we'll.
And I gotta write this down so I can immediately post something at the Bulwark. Yeah.
But this is Biden's net approval trend compared to every other president since Nixon from the start of their term until roughly the Virginia gubernatorial election. And you'll see that with
Biden is the bluish trend. Right?
Bingo. Biden's the blue trend, and then you've got a label over every of the other past presidents. Day 0 is inauguration day, because that's January, and then day 300 some is Virginia governor election day. And so what you see, Biden is doing the exact same thing as almost every president, except for George W. Bush in his first term, who, in the aftermath of September 11th, had a very big rally around the flag effect around his presidency, which is to say that he is losing. He's losing ground, he's losing people, oftentimes independents, some of whom are Democrats. I got a couple other quick data points that I can show you in terms of why. One of them has to do, or a couple of them have to do with the news cycle. So here I'm going to show you, we'll do this one later. but this is news coverage of various different topics. I'll expand it out a little bit so you can see it. So this is TV coverage of the Delta variant. So in sort of late June, early July, Delta starts to get covered a lot more. People tune into the fact that, you know, there's a new variant, and Biden's approval troubles sort of start. The second one is Afghanistan. This is news coverage of Afghanistan over the course of the last year. It occasionally pops up in foreign policy stories. You know, Biden pulls out of the country. You know, we all saw the video clips. We all saw sort of the devastation afterwards. That gets covered a lot. And then the third one is weekly. And I just put cinema in there as a proxy for just Biden being unable to get things through Congress. I feel like if she's being covered, that's basically the reason. And then when you drill down a little bit further, these are crosstabs from the Economist YouGov poll. Basically, anyone who would methodologically, you know, quibble with a lot of the other polls and do they wait for partnership and do they wait for this or the other? If you know, have someone who's like that in your life, YouGov is probably something they're okay with. And what you see here is there is these two columns right here, columns 3 and 4 are somewhat approve and or somewhat disapprove and strong disapprove. And what you see is Biden's numbers with Black respondents are pretty bad. That's 29% for a Democratic president. That's not great. 43% disapproval with Hispanic voters, also not great. But he's holding up really pretty well. You see 58% approval among white women who are college graduates. So essentially, there are parts of Biden's coalition that are pretty unhappy with him and parts that are basically exactly where they were in the 2020 election. And I apologize if I have gone on too long, but that's the basic landscape as I see it.
That's great. Sarah, Mona, take it away.
Can you apply this, David, to the Virginia governor's race now? And fill us in on how you think that's looking.
Right. So with the Virginia governor's race, it's very close. I think everyone in Virginia is, you know, probably in some kind of a, you know, panic, or if you're on the Democratic side, you're panicked that you might, you know, lose the state. If you're on the Republican side, you might be giddy with optimism at the first statewide win in 12 years possibly happening. I think essentially you can't apply this. What you see is in 10 out of the like 11 last Virginia governor races, the party who is not in the White House has won. Here, I'll show another thing that I will ask all of you not to steal because I'm probably going to publish it in a piece next week. But during Republican presidencies, you have Democrats generally winning the Virginia governor election. During Democratic presidencies, you have Republicans generally winning the Virginia governor election. So the one exception to that is 2013. Obama won re-election in 2012, and then McAuliffe won his first term in 2013. And the situation changes, but those two trends are sort of interlocked together in my mind, right? That, you know, a president takes office, they have bold plans, they do some of their bold plans, they placate their base, energize their opposition, and alienate swing voters. And then that often filters into Virginia. So it's a bluer state now than it has been in the past. So it's not an ironclad rule that the Republicans are going to win because there's a Democrat in the White House. But I would be surprised if it's a, you know, 10, 11 point win for the Democrat. I think there's going to be at least some movement, right? And it's a pretty close race.
So one of the backdrops, so the exception you mentioned, 2013 was McAuliffe's first race for governor. What was happening that year was that the Republicans were shutting down the government led by Ted Cruz, potentially, you know, alienating some of the federal employees in the Northern Virginia area or in Hampton Roads and that sort of thing, but also giving a sort of message of dysfunction by the Republican Party. And so that might have helped McAuliffe to pull it out, do you think, right? And then, so now you have the dysfunction tableau being presented by the Democrats in Washington, and that could potentially redound to Youngkin's benefit.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the two ways one way to think about Virginia's governor election is that it's sort of two schools of thought about the race, and the result is going to, show which one is correct. One school of thought is a lot like what I'm describing and a lot what you're describing, Mona, which is the idea that, these people who live in Virginia are more tuned into the federal government than voters in any other state except maybe like Maryland, right? The college educated population in Virginia disproportionately works in the federal government or works in the private industry that is dependent on the federal government. So if you have a Republican Party that is, that is drain the swamp in the way that Trump was, or if you have a Republican Party that is, kind of sabotaging things, you could argue, in the way that Cruz was, that's going to be something that's pretty negative. And that's why the race is close. That's why the polls are close, right? The second school of thought is that this is going to be a little bit more like California. And essentially, we are locked in a polarized world and no events matter. And that essentially what's going to happen is that at the last minute, Democrats are going to get enthusiastic because they're going to identify Youngkin with Trump, and McAuliffe will win by a margin that's similar to what Biden won in 2020. And we're forever locked in, these election results. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. I think McAuliffe just has an edge based on the, baseline partisanship of the state. But if you care about Virginia politics, this is not an election to sleep on, is the way I'd put it.
Well, at least McAuliffe had some help from Trump today and yesterday, right? I mean, Trump phoned into that rally where they actually pledged allegiance to a flag that was featured in the January 6th insurrection. And so that was a gift to McAuliffe, I'd say, wouldn't you?
100%. Yeah. Trump is uniquely tailored, to be bad for Republicans in Virginia. I mean, the drain the swamp message, they're going to be closer both mentally and physically to the events of January 6th than a lot of other voters. It's just a situation in which, if you think about the trade-offs, right, that Trump's version of the Republican Party does better in Pennsylvania and, Wisconsin than, say, Mitt Romney's, right? It does a lot worse in Virginia. It does a lot worse in Texas. It does worse in California. This is kind of the other end of the trade-off, right, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Sarah, you've done the focus groups recently that are, as they say in the business, right, David, qualitative research as opposed to quantitative research. I always like that fancy term for focus groups on the one hand and running the numbers on the other, but take it away.
Yeah, I think I got a taste of what happens to pollsters who weathermen when they predict, it's going to rain and everyone's like, I hate you. Why are you doing this to me? It's like pollsters, you give them bad news. I did some Democratic focus groups, both in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania last week, taped a show with JVL about the Pennsylvania group. And look, I couldn't get a Democrat who voted for Joe Biden to give him above a C- as a performance grade. And, I do think the Wisconsin group was independents that voted for Biden, and they were sort of better. And partly the independents are interesting because they were just generally more plugged in to politics. In the Pennsylvania group, nobody was following the infrastructure debate. In the Wisconsin group, about half sort of knew about it. And somebody could even name check Manchin and Sinema as, in their mind being the obstructionist ones. I might take the other end of that scale, but regardless. The thing that really jumped out at me, and tell me what you think about this, but we would ask people, to tell us, we always just do, how do you think things are going in the country? And people, the responses were things like, it's slow, nothing's getting done, nothing's happening, supply chain issues, inflation, just really negative. And you showing that graph about where the news cycle hit, I can basically demarcate my focus groups where in the beginning, there was a lot of cautious optimism. People felt like we were moving out of COVID. And I would say that hanging over the entire conversation is the psychic trauma of people feeling like they were about to turn the corner. They had started hugging people again. They were starting to feel good. They were planning vacations. And then boom, you are back into, I got to wear masks everywhere. The mandates are back on doors. You're getting ready to send your kids to school and you're feeling funky about it again. everybody's fighting over masks. So it feels like it just was a year ago and we continue to be in a doom loop of divisiveness around COVID. And so for me, and it did sort of just totally dovetail with Afghanistan, which gave kind of Afghanistan's one of those stories you bounce from, but COVID's the kind of thing that like, until you get it under control, you are slogging through it. And I think that so I have sort of two thoughts on this, which is one, priority number one really does need to be COVID. Like the one thing that comes through is that people are totally fine with the mandates, including these swing voters, college educated suburban voters. They think the mandates are great. I think Joe Biden can't lean in too far at all on COVID because people want to be done with it and he will get credit when it's gone. And some people might argue, well, isn't that just getting us back to par? That's not it is fine. It is necessary, but not sufficient, but it is necessary for him to sort of pull out of this nosedive is one thing. The second thing is just two things jump out at me in these groups. One is nobody knows what's in any of the bills. So they are prioritizing big swings over small wins that they can message on. And as a result, when you tell people, hey, what did you think about the $2 trillion COVID relief bill? They say, I don't know. They don't know. And they'll be like, I didn't like how the businesses got bailed out. That's what they'll tell you. They will have some negative thing about somebody else that got money. And so that's part of it. The other thing that was just wild to me was that they didn't talk about Republicans at all. Like if you do a MAGA group, you talk to Republicans want to tell you how Democrats are trying to destroy their way of life, that Joe Biden is dementia and being controlled by the radical far left, which might as well be Satan. And like, it is top of mind. It's in their first answers when you just say, how are things going in the country? The Democrats didn't bring up Republicans until we started asking about them. Like they weren't like, man, they're really stymieing Joe Biden's agenda. They think the other Democrats are stymieing his agenda, which is true to some degree, and the Democrats are negotiating with themselves. Anyway, I'm going on too long, but only to say one of the reasons I like focus groups is they add texture to the polling. But I would say that the focus groups in this case, because sometimes it's not the case, but in this case are really backing up what the polling is showing. And I understand that people are upset that that's what about people are saying, but like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, these are going to be really important 2022 states. Donald Trump won Pennsylvania by 40,000 votes in 2016. Joe Biden won it by 80,000 votes in 2020. Like we are sitting on a knife's edge, and all you need to do, and this is, now I'll go back to a question for you, but the thing that I think is really hard to predict, and that where I just think polling like is never going to be able to get their arms around it, is enthusiasm and turnout, right? And just what a difference. I'm interested to hear from you what a difference you think that makes, because my big concern going into 22 is that Donald Trump is on the ballot for all of the people that he attracts, and he is not on the ballot for all of the people that he repels, and that is going to create an asymmetrical sense of urgency about getting out and voting, because Republicans need to go say it was stolen, we've got to avenge Trump, and Democrats are like, I'm mad about there not being enough done on climate or whatever.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that I agree with basically everything you're saying, and I think that last point is really, really key. I was thinking about this when I was reading this afternoon, and I was thinking back to 2010, and in that election, it wasn't exactly the same because, there was no insurrection in 2019 like there was in January of 2021. But in the 2010 election, it didn't work for Democrats to try to run against Bush again, right? That just, voters had moved on. They said, okay, he's out of office. That's not a thing, right? But Obama was saying, okay, it's getting better. Things are happening. I passed this, and that. And he, paid a political price for overreach in that year. In the year 2018, which, is a little fresher in everyone's memory, you had Republicans saying in the run up to it, like, oh, have you seen AOC? Have you seen how liberal the Democrats have gotten? Like, we're definitely going to resist the midterm wave because Trump has, magical powers to turn out our voters. And that didn't happen. The midterm penalty just tends to stick because the party that's in power gets some of what it wants and gets complacent. The swing voters tend to think that the party in power overreaches, and the party that's out of power gets really, really energized. It's exactly what you're talking about. I've got one other graphic I'll just share real quick and not spend too much time on it. It's data that I think a number of people here are going to be familiar with. but this is how many House seats each president lost in midterms throughout, all the demographic and coalitional changes that have happened over the course of, 1952, Eisenhower's first election to, today when we're coming up on 2022. It's just a pattern that comes up again and again and again. The out party is more enthusiastic and they win seats. So yeah, that's all just to back up what you're saying about the focus groups and about the enthusiasm gap that typically goes through. I mean, yeah, maybe a COVID recovery makes things different, but the this time is different argument usually doesn't work.
Have you looked at, I mean, this is kind of a stupid question, maybe the average number, if you factor in the following, which is obviously kind of important. Democrats won big in 06 and 08. They picked up, I don't know, 50, 60 seats net. They then probably lost 60 seats in 2010. But in a way, you can understand that because by definition, the seats they picked up had been Republican seats. So if you're going to have an anti-democratic wave, they're going to take back seats, basically. It's not true one-to-one, but basically take back the seats they lost in the last Democratic waves, which were the anti-Bush wave of 06 and the Obama wave of 08. We had a very unusual situation in 2020 where a president ousted an incumbent president from the White House and lost seats in the House. I think his party lost 12 seats in the House. And the Senate's a little distorted by Georgia, honestly. They picked up, one Senate seat, two Senate seats, one, I guess, right? There was 51-49 going, or two, I can't remember.
It was both seats were Republican held before.
But net, they picked up in Senate, maybe two, but anyway.
Sorry, I thought you meant Georgia.
Yeah, they got to 50, but I mean,
yeah.
So they had a good year, but the Republicans basically had a good year down ballot. And so there's a little less low-hanging fruit for them to take. There are fewer Democratic sort of gains that couldn't be sustained, presumably, since the Democrats lost back their 12 most vulnerable seats already, I guess is the way I would put it, in 2020, that they had picked up in 2018. And you could argue, if you combine that with polarization, that you might be looking at a more static result than the normal wave. I mean, it could be 11 seats, not 40 seats, just if you sort of factor those things in as much as one can, and then also, presumably just projects a kind of normal, Biden approval rating of, 44 or whatever you think he's at now. So I don't know, talk about whatever aspect of that makes sense or doesn't make sense, or should be thrown out, or it's just historical and political science blather and has nothing to do with what's really going to happen. I don't know.
No, I think you made a great point. In a lot of these models, there is an exposure sort of variable that gets included because of exactly what you're talking about. If a party wins a lot, then they have more exposure and they've got more of those sort of moderates who maybe shouldn't have won in a district in a normal year. And that's less true now. So the way that I'm thinking about this is not that 2022 is necessarily going to be 2010, right? Like, or it's a 60 seat, flip is probably not going to happen in our super polarized environment. But the other side of the coin is exactly what you're talking about, is that these are thin, narrow margins. If you're thinking about projections and simulating outcomes in a 435 member House, a 5 to 8 seat flip is just not that much to ask for, even in our current day and age. So yeah, I mean, it would be surprising if it was 2010 again, given the increase in polarization that's just happened over the course of the last decade. But a 10 seat loss or a 15 seat loss for the Democrats would still be like a better than average performance that, would say that Biden is, doing better than most presidents do historically. And maybe he's, doing something right by comparison, but you still lose the chamber if that happens. So it's kind of this two-sided way of thinking about both of the benchmarks, is it a wave and what happens to chamber control, Could
I float a small theory about one contrast between this coming midterm, at least as it's shaping up so far? It's still a ways off, but this one compared with past ones is that, so take 2010 for an example, pretty much the whole Republican coalition, the whole party was furious with Obama and wanted to punish him for Obamacare and for other things. And they were really raring to get to the voting booth. This time, presumably, Sarah said, Trump is not on the ballot for the people who don't like him. That's right. But the people who do like him, they still are, it's hard to remember this, but the really committed, passionate ones still are a minority of the Republican Party. So they're going to be wanting to turn out, but that's not the same energy, I think, that we saw in 2010, where, you know, the whole Republican Party just wanted to get to the polls to punish Obama and the Democrats. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I have a couple initial thoughts on it. One is, it's true that 2010 was in a lot of ways a better political environment because, you know, polarization wasn't quite as strong. Obama had some pretty low lows. He was able to sort of overreach more than Biden can because Sinema and Manchin are kind of saying like, wait, hold up. You know, you can't do X, you can't do Y. We're not going to pass that much spending, like that sort of thing, where they're kind of, you know, these forces of moderation on the Biden agenda. And, you know, there were definitely there were more moderate Democrats, but Obama still had those 60 votes, so he could do more. Anyways, my point being, though, that I think that just general partisan hatred has increased a lot over the course of the last 10 years. I think that matters. I think that there's two sides to the sort of Trump equation, right? There's the side that, you know, there's the possible problems with, you know, Republican turnout that you named, and some others have argued that, you know, Trump's voters won't turn out unless he himself is on the ballot. I think the other side of that is that I think there are some voters who were Democrats in 2020 and Democrats in 2016 who felt the sort of crisis of those elections, who may also be less likely to turn out. I wouldn't be surprised if you got corresponding decreases on sort of both sides in 2022. So yeah, I mean, obviously it's a year out, and I don't want to sound too certain that Republicans are going to take the chamber because, you know, my God, we have a global pandemic that could heal. If there's anything that's an X factor, that might be it, right? Like, it's worth being sort of humble about these things. What I would say, though, is that I haven't seen a lot of contrary indicators quite yet. In the first half of this, in the first sort of first year of the 2-year stretch between the presidential and the midterms, I haven't seen a lot that would make me think that Democrats are going to buck history and make gains. That could materialize next year, but so far the indicators haven't showed up.
Let me ask one question and then ask Sarah to comment on it, and then you can make whatever other point you want to make, Sarah, too, as well. But you and I have discussed this so much. How much is the character of the Republican candidates, particularly for the Senate, I think, where candidates get better known? House candidates probably a little more. The wave goes so far and it carries the candidates along, and no one quite knows who your local House challenger is, or in an open seat, certainly hard to get a name ID. Senate candidates get pretty well known, especially in this day and age with $100 million spent in these competitive races. How much does it matter if they nominate Trumpy candidates, let's just put it in a simple way, in Ohio, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Herschel? I mean, how much from a sort of political science point of view, if I can put it that way, how much does it matter if Herschel Walker is the candidate in Georgia rather than a, quote, more moderate, more normal, more respectable, less accident gaffe prone candidate? And the same I'd say about Ohio, but Pennsylvania, there are really several states, New Hampshire, where people are kind of semi-assuming almost a Republican pickup if Sununu runs against Hassan. I would say the sophisticated types think Sununu's by strong. Now there's some Trump candidate who's screaming and yelling about, I just saw today was an election fraud or something else, like anti-vax or something, and Trump might endorse, I can't remember if it's him or her, honestly, that candidate. And, maybe Sununu won't get in. And that's just how candidate dependent are we? I guess that you could address the House level too, but I'm particularly struck by this on the Senate level.
Yeah, I'd say two quick things, because I want to make sure that Sarah gets a chance to register on the last subject too. The two quick things I would say on the Senate side, candidate quality definitely does matter. I mean, Sharon Angle, Christine O'Donnell, Todd Aiken, these names feel like they're a lifetime ago, but if you throw these things into a regression and you have a bad candidate, you have someone who, makes these sort of statements, who can't fundraise well, who kind of, is mired in this sort of stuff, that does exert a penalty. The penalty has decreased over time. So I would say that in Ohio, it matters less than in, Pennsylvania. But I think the candidate quality does matter, and Republicans have shot themselves in the foot before in the Senate and could very well do so again. The other thing that I would say is that 2010 was arguably Republicans had some wins and some losses in their candidate recruitment in 2010, but the House still flipped. So there's some level at which a bad Senate candidate in one state doesn't necessarily translate to the key other districts in this other state. But yeah, I think that's a good point you're making.
Sarah?
It's a great point. It's the point I was going to make. I was going to, I would say it's a big part of kind of our theory of the case, which is if Democrats want to stave off a wave, and I think 2010 is a very good example, because I think there's not much they can do in the House in a lot of ways. You know, I mean, like redistricting alone is going to get them within a couple seats. And that's, Republicans haven't even been as aggressive as they could have been on the redistricting front. I mean, they could have basically redistricted themselves into the majority. And if they had been a couple more aggressive in a couple places. So I do think, though, from a messaging standpoint, my whole point about the fact that Trump is on the ballot for the people he attracts, not for the people he repels. Okay, put him on the ballot for the people he repels. And McAuliffe has been trying to do this. And I keep trying to explain to reporters, it's not the same because help me guys, Youngkin is like, you know, he's like Trump in the streets, and he's Mitt Romney in the sheets, right? He's like walking around in his tech vest, and he's like a billionaire CEO. And so he's not Herschel Walker. He's not Eric Greitens. He's not Sean Parnell. And so I think he is trying to thread the needle. He's trying to thread the needle to knit together those suburban college educated voters and the downstate Trumpers, whereas Herschel Walker's just bananas. Like Sean Parnell is trying to put a gag order on his wife right now. Eric Greitens is working really hard for Trump's endorsement. He may get it. He tied a woman up in her basement, photographed her, had to resign in shame, scammed a veterans charity. Like these are like the Todd Aiken narrative on steroids. And I think if Trump's going to help you out that way, like Democrats should be able to put Trump on the ballot and attach him to, I mean, Josh Mandel, you may not be able to actually beat him in Ohio because it's really red now and it's like an R+9 state, but you know, you can make him you can give him the national profile of a Trumpy candidate and have a bunch of people in other states that are sort of less red, like Arizona, going, what is going on with these guys?
And force them to ask them, what do you think of Josh Mandel saying X? I mean, you know, you force them to comment and hold and take responsibility.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Mona. Yeah, and I would just add, this is a little bit of what we saw in California as well, where, you know, when people were disengaged and they thought it was, oh, it's just about Newsom, you know, the recall looked a lot closer. And then A, Democrats just got more engaged generally, but B, they said, Larry Elder is basically a mini Trump, and that engaged people in that more candidate-driven election. So I think that's a big difference between California and Virginia, which is that Youngkin and Larry Elder are not the same in the eyes of voters.
Can we talk about the Democrats and social cultural issues for a minute, though? Because, you know, for those of us in the Bulwark world and so forth, I mean, you know, our organizing principle is that Trumpism and the devolution of the Republican Party into a cult and an authoritarian, you know, organization is the great threat, and it's something that has to be opposed with every particle of our being. But meanwhile, out in the world, right, most people aren't thinking that way. They're thinking, oh, there's a race in Virginia. You know, the Democrats, they're closing Thomas Jefferson. They're changing the admission requirements for the magnet school, Thomas Jefferson High School for Science. They are introducing, if not CRT, then, you know, kind of woke styles of addressing racial questions. You know, they are having boys be able to use the girls' restroom if they so choose. And they say, you know what, I just, those Democrats are alienating me, and I have a sense that Democrats have no clue how alienating this is to exactly the college-educated sort of suburban voters that they desperately need to hold on to their slim majority.
Yeah, I think this is big, and I think this is why there's been so much sort of, you know, energy and freak out around the 2020 result, even though Democrats won, right? Is that Democrats believed that by nominating Joe Biden, they were able to, sort of run away a little bit from the cultural issues and like nominate their most moderate candidate possible and put a face that would, play well in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan on the party. And it worked in the sense that they won, but it was still not a landslide in the middle of a global pandemic. So anyways, it's a long way of saying, I think that you're right. I think that normal voters in the Trump era and now in the Biden era are still just kind of processing politics in the same way that they processed politics beforehand.
Yep.
Sure, polarization is increasing, but people care about like, okay, is my general livelihood good? Do these guys in power seem competent? Do they not? The things about like threats to democracy, I think motivate some voters, but I think that they're a little abstract to others. And so it's a situation where at least I've noticed looking back on the last, 5-6 years, I think my analysis and the analysis of other people in the world of like data, politics, forecasting, or whatever has been the most accurate when it's sort of hewed to those rules, and the least accurate when it's like, oh, well, I think this time's going to be different. So yeah, I think that the cultural issues are a place where Republicans have gained voters. Immigration was, key for Donald Trump to win his primary and then flip some significant chunk in 2016. And then in 2020, you could argue that some of the cultural issues were key to flipping Latino voters. So this is a thing where I think Democrats, either have a blind spot or feel trapped between what they want to do and what's politically viable. But, that's my slightly meandering response to what you're saying, which is I think you're making good points.
Yeah, the one thing I would just tag on it. So I've got for the focus group podcast, I've got a conversation coming up with David Shore, who is somebody that I really enjoy reading. And one of the points that he makes, besides, his points about the demographic shifts and who comprises the parties and all this stuff I'm fascinated by, is how detached Democratic operatives and all of the people who comprise sort of elite Dem world, how detached they are from sort of Democratic voters and how that gap continues to widen. And so like if you are working, on any Democratic policy group and you did a straw poll of 2020 presidential primary candidates, like Elizabeth Warren with a bullet running away with it. And you couldn't find a person for miles to tell you they wanted Joe Biden to be the nominee. But of course, between college educated suburban boomers and Black voters, like Joe Biden's a lock. Claiborne comes out and says, this is the guy. And everybody goes, then that's the guy. And you hear this in the focus groups. I mean, the young people like accept Joe Biden as a bridge candidate. Like they accept that. They understood that he was the consensus candidate. He was what it took to stop Donald Trump. But I do think that Democrats have a real what's next problem, because there is no appetite that I have found talking to Democrats in these focus groups for Kamala Harris. And I even wonder, look, I'm basically here for this neoliberal Pete Buttigieg, let's talk about a new politics type thing. I don't know that you can run a white guy, even if he's gay, because I think that hurts you with people. People don't want to talk about it. We don't think about it as much, but I think it probably does hurt you with some section of the exact voters who are abandoning the Democrats right now. And so like, who is their future? Because their elite class wants them to go in a direction that is not politically viable in terms of building the kind of broad coalition needed to fend off this dangerous version of the Republican Party.
Connor Lamb. They need Connor Lamb to be their front, in the front hall. That's their guy, right?
I mean,
somebody like
he's
that
our guy.
Needs to win the Pennsylvania Democratic primary first.
Yeah, somebody like that.
Yeah.
I think would be.
David, what do you think? I mean, what's the real balance of electoral power in the Democratic Party? Because, you know, people like me want to say maybe the moderates aren't as weak as all my Republican friends claim. It's all really, they're just hanging on by their fingernails and they're about to collapse. And then they probably win primaries, you know, in New York City and Virginia and outside of Cleveland or outside Cleveland and so forth. And so it doesn't look like they're that, for a left-wing party, they're certainly nominating a lot of people like Terry McAuliffe and, you know, Eric Adams, a former cop. And so, but I don't know, is that really true, or is that sort of a little bit temporary? And would that work on the president? And I mean, just what is your sense of the electoral balance of power, if that's the right way to put it, in the Democratic Party? And any thoughts on 24 if Biden were not to run?
Yeah, no, these are great things. And I thought we were going to get into the popularism discourse at some point. I got three sort of reactions to this. One is that I think that one sort of synthesis between what Bill's saying and what Sarah's saying is that the moderates and the progressives have sort of different types of power almost, right? Because like what Bill's saying, you know, McAuliffe wins the nomination, you have Eric Adams in New York, Joe Biden is saved at the last minute by Clyburn, like Sarah pointed out. Like a lot of the voters who are more moderate and more sort of, you know, standard old style liberal in the sense of it's interest group politics. They want something that they're interested in and they're willing to sort of barter with the rest of the coalition. It's less ideological. I think they have a lot of voting power. But I think if you look at Biden's platform in 2020, by a lot of measures, it was the most sort of liberal, progressive, whatever word you want to use for it, platform in decades, right? So that speaks to what Sarah was talking about in terms of sort of the elite class of Democrats having a lot of extra power. So I think both things are true. And, you know, when the Democratic nominee comes out in 2024, I'm guessing you'll see some mix of both of those. You'll have moderate voters have a thumbprint on the process, and then sort of, you know, progressive Democratic, like professional Democrats also having a thumbprint on the process. I think that, you know, in terms of who's going to be their person in 2024 if Biden steps down, that's a hard one. I think that it's going to be tough for the Democrats not to nominate a sitting vice president. That just comes with a lot of clout. That comes with a lot of institutional power. That comes with a big head start. Yeah, I don't know. It also depends on what level of emergency the Democrats believe the 2024 election to be. Because in 2008, you know, President Bush's approval ratings were not great. And that gave a lot of Democrats room to say, okay, we're going to nominate the more liberal candidate. We're going to nominate the candidate that's more aspirational and the candidate that might lose votes for reasons A, B, C, and D. We're going to nominate Obama. And that, you know, worked out. In some years, there's a risk assessment like that, right? In 2020, that was not the case. They said, we can't do 4 more years of Trump. We're going to nominate the person that we think is more electable. We're going to do Joe Biden. So part of who comes out of the Democratic primary depends on how large Trump looms. If it's Trump again, I would guess they pick their most electable person. If it's not, I don't know what would happen. You know, if you poll Democrats and ask them who, and this is the last point I'll make on this, is that in the 2020 primary, Data for Progress, which is, you know, a very progressive sort of on the left end of left firm, I think they asked candidates, who do you intend to vote for? And if you could make someone president with a magic wand, who would you pick? And the Biden won on the first question and Warren won on the second. So the risk assessment matters.
Mm-hmm.
Say
Hey,
where you
David,
mentioned.
can you, oh, sorry. Did you want to make a point, Bill?
I was going to ask stiff questions, so go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, well, can you, since you mentioned popularism, can you talk about that a little bit? Define it first in case people aren't familiar with it, and then tell us what you think about it.
Yeah. So
And can I ask the footnote question on it, because when you define it, I mean, I think in Sarah and I would say, you know, our discourse probably sort of assumes, I think with some empirical backing, that more moderate is more electable, basically, that if the Republican Party goes kooky right, Democratic Party goes kooky left. There's kind of a lot of history of that, Goldwater McGovern, et cetera. There is a more sophisticated view in the populism that gets this a little bit, that's a little too simple. That, I mean, in some ways you could go pretty far right. Trump isn't exactly conventional right, but it's certainly, you know, populist authoritarian right. And you get more votes than the more, quote, respectable. There was the autopsy, the conventional wisdom of the 2013 autopsy maybe wasn't right as an actual analytical matter, much as I would prefer it as that kind of party. And on the left, there's always been a strain of thought that the moderates are overthinking everything. And in fact, people love free things. And Mona and I and Sarah sit here and say, 3.5 trillion, are you kidding? Can you have priorities? Could you do childcare and not everything else? But the voters think, great, more stuff, So, I mean, that sort of fits in with the populism. But I'm just curious, are we wrong to be overweighting the political viability of moderation?
Yeah.
Great question.
I don't think so on your question, Bill, and I'll get to why when we're talking through populism. So populism is extreme. I think you're right, is what I'm saying, Bill. So populism is this extreme inside baseball, wonky sort of debate that's going on with the whole world of political data, but focused in Democratic circles. And essentially, the problem that everyone on the sort of left side of the spectrum is trying to solve is, how do we win elections? We got really close to losing in 2020, a year when Trump presided over a pandemic and, according to voters, bungled his handling of it. A year when they nominated their most sort of conventionally electable candidate in terms of issue positions, in terms of affect, in terms of roots in the swing states. Like it's this just sort of attempting to solve a question. So the popularism side, which includes, David Shore's the most notable booster, but just a lot of people, your Ezra Kleins, your Matt Iglesias, people. I would say, honestly, most nonpartisan data analysts, I don't know if they would call themselves this, but have written things that, are in the popularist vein. I would say that I think the populist sort of team gets a lot more right than they get wrong. Their thought is Democrats have some issues where they're popular. They need to talk about those issues. They need to de-emphasize the issues where they're not popular, which is like more of the cultural battles, things like that. Immigration is a topic that often gets talked about. They need to speak more like normal Americans, not like you're in, a seminar in the college class in upper level humanities, right? And that by doing that, you sort of put the brakes a little bit on this educational polarization. You're able to win more elections generally, do better in Congress, and generally have Democrats win more. I think that's a fairly faithful representation of the popularist position. They get a lot of blowback from the progressive left. Some of the objections are, we can just win on turnout alone, which I don't think is very well supported by the data. Another is that, well, we're acting like Democrats are the only people with choices here. If Trump brings up immigration or brings up cultural issues, or if the media focuses on this issue or that issue, there's not a lot that we can do. Another is there's value to taking progressive positions on issues X, Y, and Z. And so the debate kind of rages from there. My basic thought is that what Bill said in terms of nominating more moderate candidates, I think there's just empirical backing for that. If you're a progressive Democrat, maybe you say, well, it's not worth it, and purity is what matters. And that to me sounds like Republicans prior to Trump, kind of sacrificing wins for purity, which I think didn't end up going very well for the party at that time. I think that some of them, I think the objection that, you can only control so much is valid, but the general analysis of it, that you really talk about your popular stuff and you soft pedal your other stuff because the nation is polarized and you need to win swing voters, that just seems sound to me.
And you think so one of the things you read is, there's no such thing as a swing voter anymore. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, there's a small segment of voters that are swing voters. The thing that I think gets a little bit lost is that they don't talk and act like David Brooks. Like swing voters, like typically
not that there's anything wrong with that,
No, there's a reason he's as widely read as he is. I haven't spent time talking to him, but by all accounts, he's a great guy. Anyways, but the point is that swing voters are oftentimes low information voters. They're very mixed demographically. They're people who, aren't tuning in a lot of them, they kind of defy categorization a little bit, but oftentimes they aren't tuning into every single twist and turn of every single thing that's happening. So in terms of these voters, if you're advocating for generally like, center left economic policy that's going to help them, but not go, way, way, way off to the left, that's probably going to help. And I think that would be, I think that's a natural outgrowth of the popularist position, but I don't want to speak for other people.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I would just add that there's this, people think of, so first of all, drives me crazy when people say there aren't swing voters, because there definitely are. And in our hyper-polarized society, they become more and more important all the time. But swing voters aren't the only thing that's happening, right? I always think it's more helpful to think about what's going on with the parties as a trade, right? And sometimes, like, Tim wrote a really good piece about this a while back, but I think this is absolutely right. And so these white working class voters, let's think about your Pittsburgh areas, your Steeltown, right? These are people who used to be economic liberals, and now they are culturally MAGA, and they are moving towards this more populist Republican Party. At the same time, people who voted for Mitt Romney and John McCain, think about this as your Maricopa County, getting bluer all the time. These college-educated suburban voters are increasingly what put Biden over the edge, and they are moving in the direction. This is I feel this acutely because I feel like I am somebody who was getting demographically shifted out of the Republican Party because of this trade and because it is changing what the parties look like and how they sound. And so there's the swing, but there's also how accelerated are either of these groups in this trade? And can you speed up the acceleration of college-educated suburban voters as they become future former Republicans or red dog Democrats, while these white college, non-college voters, become increasingly sort of Trumpified? And that's why Iowa's never going blue again. And, Arizona's turning, more purple all the time.
That's exactly right. Nothing to add. Yeah.
What about, final thing we should go, but just on the numbers, I mean, the decline of the white working class was overstated, right? I mean, that's to say the notion that, the country's getting so diverse, they're losing 2% more, non-white voters every 4 years. Some truth to all of that, obviously. It is just a demographic fact. But there's also the non-white number is a little confusing because it includes every Hispanic, and half of them are intermarrying, like Ted Cruz's kids, non-white. I don't know. I mean, what does that really mean? And what does it mean for obviously other working class? But I guess who makes this point the most? I suppose Nate Cohn, maybe. I mean, there are a lot of, for all the more people go to college, but there's still more white working class voters than there are anything else, right?
Right.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Politics moves fast, but demographics move slow, right? And I think that there was this, I think there's a connection between all the discourse everyone's having about populism and what the Democrats can win and what the Democrats can't win. And, the Obama era discussion of are Republicans doomed by Democrats? It feels like everyone looked at those trend lines that said, oh, by 2050, the US is going to be only 50% white and 50% other groups. And it's almost like people's brains just assumed that 2050 was now, right? When it wasn't. And I feel like that was a huge analytical error. This is a Nate Cohn hobby horse, Sean Trendy, my friend and mentor from Real Clear Politics. This is one of his things too, is that we're in a situation where if you break down the groups in the way that they're traditionally broken down, white non-college voters still make up a plurality. And that is the elephant in the room. I did not mean to do that, but that's what it is.
Could I just add one thing on behalf of my colleague on Beg to Differ, Linda Chavez, because she's shed a lot of light on this too, where she pointed out that census question that got so much attention this year, where so many more people said that they were not white. She said that's because they changed the wording of the question between the 10 years ago and now. It gave people a lot more options for what they could identify themselves as. That's why you got all these people who are giving different things rather than they had given before. It really doesn't suggest that much. It's been way over-interpreted. But the other thing she points out, which is interesting, is that so many Hispanics who, the conventional wisdom tends to say they're non-white, most of them think of themselves as white. And so, that's another way in which this gets very confusing, all these categories.
And if you're a Hispanic who's 50 years old, who's been here for 40 years maybe, and whose kids are marrying, other Americans, and you work for an energy firm in the Rio Grande Valley, I don't know that you're that different from the quote white working class in Pennsylvania, right? You don't think, oh, I've got to follow. And maybe you are a little more sympathetic, of course, to immigrants trying to come across the border, but the notion just from 5, 6, 7 years ago that that's sort of what's going to just drive all these voters to the Democrats seem not to be the case in 2020. And that's true for a lot of groups. People just they forget demography's slow, but also groups change a lot. Second generation is awfully different from first gen. Those of us who are sons and daughters and grandchildren of immigrants know this, right? Second generation, third generation, awfully different from the first generation. And that's just natural and it's good in a way. But I mean, so, yeah.
And when some 26-year-old progressive shows up at those people's doors and starts referring to them as Latinx, and they go, what the hell are you talking about?
Right.
That is not how I identify. It creates this sense of like, who are you guys talking to? And it goes back to that social cultural stuff, which I got to tell you, I know we're over time, but the theory of Biden's case, which is like money, 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 and you'll love us. I just disagree. I think culture is going to trump cash every time.
Yeah.
David, final comment before we let you go, and thank you for spending all this time. What should we follow? 2 minutes, 1 minute. We're watching, there are a million polls, you read an article, McAuliffe's down five in the Fox poll. Is there anything that's is a good aggregator, or what 2 websites should we all go to every day?
Yeah, well, obviously,
apart from following you,
but the Washington Post and the Bulwark, easy answer. There you go.
But thank you. We can sign off now.
If you want poll aggregation, I think both Real Clear Politics and 538 have good aggregates of the relevant races. They're still sort of on top of that game, so I think those are good for that too. Yeah.
Good. Well, that's helpful. And you think well of the YouGov poll? You suggested that earlier. That's
I mean, I'm a pluralist when it comes to the polls. I think that it's like there's some people who will say only this one has the right methodology and we can only use this one, whatever. I think the averaging tends to outperform. I think we shouldn't be snobs about methodology because what works in one election fails in the next. So I think the aggregate is the way to go if you're trying to track it.
Yeah, and the trend as opposed to an individual. I mean, that I'm struck by having studied a tiny bit of this decades ago in political science. There's a reason they said, these things are plus or minus 3, and also they're 95%, likely to be correct, because if you put those 2 things together, that's a pretty big variance. Plus or minus 3 does not mean, it means plus or minus 6, right? In terms of the margin, right?
Yeah,
so,
there's a lot of,
you know what I mean? So people sort of they go crazy. Oh my God, someone lost 2 points. That could literally just be noise, right? That could be the random 600 people they called. If they'd called a different 600, it'd just be just 2% different. That's why it's a poll.
Yeah, no, the aggregation
that's where the
is designed to help kill noise. And then beyond that, there's some things that can't be captured in statistical design that you have to empirically say, like there's this much error because of design, whatever. But that's far down the road. If you look at the aggregates, there's still going to be error, but it's less error than other places. So that's where you go.
That's good. Thank you. David Byler, thanks an awful lot for joining us. Really fascinating discussion, which I'm sure everyone enjoyed as much as Sarah and Mona and I did. So thanks again. And thank you all, Bulwark Plus colleagues and friends for joining us again today.
Thanks, David. That was awesome.
That was great.
Thank you.
David, you need to fix your